Hey y'all, this is Bewindi Bob, your lovely host with Empower to Empower You podcast. Listen, before you listen to the show, I wanted to quickly check in with you. Have you purchased the books Empowerment for You, Encouragement for Your Emotional and Spiritual Wellness, and the Empower to Empower You workbook? If you have not, please visit bewindi.com and get your resources today. You can also find those on Amazon. You could just search my name, Bewindi Bob, and they will come up. If you have received and if you have purchased those resources, those amazing resources for you, would you do me a favor? Would you write a review on Amazon and share how these books have been a blessing to you, how they've added value to your lives? I really want to hear from you. How are the books helping you? What are you learning from the books? Share your takeaways with me. Share it on the review. Listen, I would love for you to do that for me. And also, don't forget to rate and review the podcast. All right, let's get to the show. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Empowered to Empower You podcast. I am your lovely host, Miss Bewindi Bob. If you're joining in for the first time, I really want to just welcome you and just lovingly thank you so much for joining, because you could be listening to any other episode at this time. If you've been following me since January 2020, it's so good to have you join us again. Today, I am excited. Well, y'all know I'm always excited. I wake up excited. But I'm excited today to have another amazing guest. I haven't had a guest in the last couple of episodes. It's just been y'all just been hearing my voice. But today I am honored to have this guest, y'all. She has taught me so much. I just love learning from Litsa. So her name is Litsa Williams. Today we're gonna talk about what's your grief and all things grief. This is such a relevant topic, especially for these times. And so Litsa is a licensed clinical social worker. She's the co-founder of What's Your Grief, one of the country's largest online grief and bereavement support communities. And this is accessed by nearly 5 million grieving individuals and professionals every single year. So What's Your Grief offers hundreds of free grief articles. I actually love to access it. I love the community that they have provided, and I pull a lot from their information to help me support my clients. So I'll let Litsa talk a lot about that, but I want to welcome you all to episode 117, and I want to welcome Litsa Williams to the Empower to Empower You podcast. Hey, Litsa.
Hey, I'm so excited to be here, and 117 episodes. That's so impressive.
Thank you. When I started, I never imagined that I would be saying 117. I mean, I remember being nervous to even start. I doubted myself, like, who's going to listen to what I have to say? And so far, it has been just a source of inspiration. And literally every podcast episode is information, insight, inspiration for people as we talk about all things Jesus Christ or mental health, to help people become the better version of themselves. So you get to be part of that, and I'm so excited.
I know, I'm so excited too. I'm really grateful to be able to be part of it.
Yes, yes. And I love your name, Litsa. Litsa.
Oh,
It
thank
just sounds like
you.
Litsa.
It's Greek. My mom is Greek, so
What
it
does
was
it mean?
it was my grandmother's name.
What does it mean?
It means little love.
Oh, I love it. I love names with meaning.
Yep, absolutely, me too. So it's one of those names you don't hear very often either. So when they call your name out at Starbucks, I don't have to worry anybody else is gonna grab
Absolutely.
like you too. I bet you don't have to worry that anybody else is gonna go for your drink.
There's no other Bewindi. No.
Exactly.
Bewindi means God is with. Like when they call my full name, I'm like, wait, who am I in trouble? Like, what's up? Bewindi Bob? Like, what,
I
Yeah.
love that.
Awesome. Well, tell us a little bit about why you became passionate about supporting people who are grieving.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I think a lot of times when people hear my story, they assume that I always knew that grief was what I wanted to do, because grief has really been a big part of my life since I was really young. And I have one sister who's 6 years younger than me, but in between the two of us, my mom had a baby who was stillborn when I was 4.
Oh,
And I always say that's like really where grief became kind of baked into my family, because I was so lucky. Like I just said, my mom is Greek. And within that cultural tradition, we talk about people who died forever. Like we memorials every year. You come into church and they do something in the Greek Orthodox Church every year on the anniversary of someone's death, not just for that first year, but in this ongoing way. So Christopher, who died, was buried in the cemetery where all my other family members went. And even though I was only 4 at the time, my parents talked to me about all of that. And we would always, when we went to the cemetery, we would always go and visit Christopher's grave along with everybody else's. And so I think I came from a family where talking about death and talking about grief was really normalized in a wonderful way. And then, lost some other people along the way, but really probably significantly when I was 18, my dad died. And so that was a really significant loss for my whole family. And my sister was I was 18, my sister was only 12. And it was a really, really rough for her. I was away at college. My mom and my sister were just muddling through that grief alone. And my sister, I'm very grateful. She's always comfortable with me sharing. She developed a really bad addiction. And so my sister then, for really the next 15 years, probably had a really real an addiction that escalated pretty quickly, but became a really bad heroin addiction. And when we were in our 20s, her boyfriend, who was like a member of our family, he lived with my mom and my sister, he was incredible. He died of an overdose. And so from all those things, I think people hear that, and that was a lot of stuff that happened young, and people thought like, oh, that must have really called you to work in grief right away. And it really, I still took kind of a winding path to get there. I started working certainly in fields that were maybe helping professions. I finished school and I was working with teens who were in foster care, and then I was working in the homeless services. But I had never thought like grief is what I'm going to do. I was like, I'm going to be in this social work field somewhere, but I wasn't really sure where. And as I was working in foster care and then working in homeless services, I just became so aware that like loss is everywhere. Like even if it wasn't death, all the kids I was working with I worked in a group home for teenagers who were in foster care but couldn't be placed for some reason. And, they were just all grieving so many losses, even if they weren't death losses. And in homeless services, it was the same thing with people who had been grieving. And I knew for myself that when my sister had this addiction, that I felt like I was grieving the sister I had when she was clean and sober, when she was using. And so I think that was when it really, I decided to get my MSW. And that was when it really started to crystallize as I was in that program. I thought, gosh, there's one course in this entire program on grief and loss. And it was all about death-related grief. It was just about bereavement. And it was one course and it was an elective. And I was like, this is unbelievable that I've worked, in these different areas. I've had this personal experience. And I thought, like, if I'm going into a social work program, they're going to be talking about grief. And I was like, nobody's talking about grief. What's that about? So that's really where I started being more and more interested and thinking, you know what, we need to be doing better. And I was feeling more pulled towards this. And so when I finished, I was working, and where I met Eleanor is we were working for a program where I was working with families who had experienced unexpected and often traumatic losses in Baltimore. And we would work with families from the hospital, from right when they found out that their loved one died, for at least 2 years after. So, sometimes more than that. And it was mostly heart attacks, it was homicides, suicides, overdoses, and strokes. So it was like the opposite of hospice, no mental preparation, it was just a very different
Sure.
type of loss. And I just thought so many people, even if they're not doing my job where they're working in grief, anybody who's working in this, here in Baltimore, we have a lot of loss. Like there's a lot of issues with violence and substance use. And I was like, every teacher in this city, every guidance counselor in this city, every social worker in this city, like everybody's working with grief.
Yes.
But nobody's getting a lot of support and training and learning. And so that's kind of how Eleanor and I met. That's kind of how I ended up in this space of really over time crystallizing that grief was where I wanted to spend the rest of my career. So that's how I ended up here.
Well, I am sorry for your loss,
Oh,
that
thank
you mentioned
you.
for sure. And I appreciate, we never know how we end up in the purposeful place where we serve. And sometimes it comes from painful experiences, right? But I appreciate your service. Thank you for your service.
Oh, well, thank you. And thank you for, inviting
Yeah.
me in this space to just talk about this, and for the fact that it's something that you have been doing work to help people with and to help people be more aware of, because I think it's a slow process that we're getting grief out there more openly discussed.
Yes. And you said something earlier, loss is everywhere. That's such a pervasive, like that's such a real statement, because it truly is. Like every client who comes either has two things underlying: trauma or loss.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always look like somebody died.
Yes,
Right?
exactly.
It's the loss of a dream, the loss of what I thought life could be,
Yep.
even before COVID and after COVID. There's a whole lot of loss every single where that we look. And so when we're able to have clients raise awareness of this is what this is,
Yeah.
when you name it, you can move through it.
Absolutely. And I think when you name and when you give people that space to say, it's okay for me to call this grief. I think sometimes people feel like, oh, I can't call this grief because I know people who have had all these people die. And that's like this special word that's reserved for death. And it's like anything that we are attached to in meaningful ways and that we love and care about, when we lose that, grief is our natural response to the loss of anything that's important to us. And that is so many things that fall in that umbrella. Definitely not just death. So I think giving people that permission is huge.
It's so huge. So I know I've attended a 3-hour training with you. So this podcast, unfortunately, we don't have 3 hours. I would love to have 3 hours.
Sure.
But people will stop listening, right? So I know this is such a high level overview, because again, y'all, we're gonna make sure that you hear a little bit more towards the end of Litsa's resources about What's Your Grief, because I want to encourage you to plug in, follow her, connect with her, because she has so many resources between her and her other partner, Eleanor, that they do this work together. So let's talk a lot about, let's expose the misconceptions. I know you've had to do that a lot of grief. Like, let's just kind of identify, what are those myths?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, the one, if anybody remembers one thing, I think they're probably the biggest myth that we like to dispel first is just this idea that there is a timeline to grief, that grief has an expiration date, that we grieve for a year and then we kind of reach acceptance and find closure and we move on. And I think we really always want to help people to understand that, yes, grief changes with time. It evolves. We change. We learn how to manage it. We learn how to cope. But that grief is always going to be. If we loved somebody, if we cared for someone, and they left this imprint on us, that imprint is going to be there until the day we die. There are going to be those hard days that we feel like it feels like the first week, even though it's been 10 years, because something reminds me of that time, or because I'm facing a time in my life where I'm just feeling so deeply the sense of loss that person isn't here for me. And so just normalizing that idea that we grieve in some way forever. And it doesn't mean that you didn't really cope with it, right? If suddenly in 5 years you have a emotional week and you're feeling pushed over by your grief. Sometimes people will think, oh, I thought I dealt with this. I must not have really dealt with it. No,
Mhm.
like that's just not how it works. It's just that
Yeah.
there's always going to be these moments, these little eruptions that come up, and it doesn't mean you didn't deal with it. It just means that that's how life and grief is. So I
Mhm.
think that's probably the one that we hear the most, that we always like to say no.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely. And nothing's wrong. Like grief doesn't mean you have a problem that needs to be fixed.
yes.
It's an experience. It's an experience that you allow yourself to feel and that you lean into, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that that's definitely the one that if people remember nothing else, I think that's the one that we really like to focus on. I think the other, I mean, there are a bunch of others, I think, that when we get down and a little bit more granular, but I think another one that people don't even realize they have is that they think grief is just all about sadness. But,
Mhm.
that idea that like grief is just this emotional experience of being sad.
Sure.
And you go through grief and you realize very quickly, first, it is like so many emotions. It's you have got guilt and regret and anger and relief. And, sometimes like so many different emotions that are kind of wrapped up together in grief. But then it's not just even emotions, all of a sudden it can have you reflecting on your sense of meaning and purpose in the world, like spiritual questions. You can be all of a sudden thinking, am I prioritizing the right things in my life? Stuff that felt really important before
Mhm.
doesn't feel important at all anymore. You're like, how was I worrying about this
Yes.
stuff that now feels meaningless? So it's kind of this spiritual and existential experience. It can be really physical and behavior. Like people won't realize that all of a sudden they're having muscle aches and stomach problems and all these things that come up, and they don't associate it with grief at all. But we
Mhm.
have a stress response in our body. When we lose someone, our body goes into crisis
Yes.
mode and stress response mode, and that can have so many physical implications
Mhm.
too. And so to see that, so just helping people to understand that grief isn't just like this feeling of sadness after a loss. It's this entire constellation of different things that happens as we're grieving.
Absolutely. Let's jump down to, you've heard the famous stages of grief.
Okay.
And I know that that's something you're passionate about this whole
Yes.
subject of grief, but definitely passionate about. Please stop talking about stages of grief type of thing. And so, you helped me actually like reframe that learning and change that perspective. And a lot of times sometimes I use the task of mourning versus
Mhm.
instead of the
Yep.
stages of grief, and
Yep.
just helping me to reframe my learning that we don't grieve in stages. We may grieve through the stages, right? We may
Sure.
experience all the things, but grief does not happen in stages. And so, take a moment to explain that.
Yeah. I think that the stages are so appealing. Like I wish that I
Yes,
could be like, we grieve in stages and we
yes,
get, we deny, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, done. But unfortunately, I think they feel appealing because we want something that is as scary and chaotic and difficult as grief. We love the idea that we can make it neat and nice and tidy. But the reality is, grief looks so different for everyone. And they've done research around this, and they find that, yes, most people do experience at some point those 5 different things in some way, but not in order. Some people don't experience any in a significant. Lots of people are like, I was never in denial. I never felt angry. I didn't feel these different things. So it depends on the person.
yeah.
And that I think one of the things that we started to learn with time is that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she developed those stages when she was working with people who were dying, not with people who were grieving.
Yes.
And she said, when people receive a terminal illness, these are the things I see that happen over time. And then other people kind of took her idea and they started applying it to grief. And then she tried to kind of do some work applying it. But she was very quick to say, this is never how I intended it. I never meant for people to think that these were universal or that they were linear or that everyone was going to do this in the same way. So I think when we even remember that she never meant for this to be what it looks like, it can help us to say grief is unique for each of us. We may see the stages and think, okay, I like really resonate with some stuff in there. And we may see them and think this has nothing to do with me. That's okay. It doesn't mean I'm grieving wrong because I didn't go through the stages. It doesn't mean any of that. The tasks of mourning, I think William Morton, who wrote the tasks of mourning, he was in so many ways responding to the criticisms of Kubler-Ross, because people were out there saying, well, like, what do I do? Just sit around and wait to go through these stages? Like, what am I just supposed to like hang out here in denial and hope that maybe I get to anger soon? You know, it felt very passive. Right. Even if you believed that the stages resonated, they felt passive. And one of the things I appreciate about what William Morton tried to do with these tasks was he sort of said, what do we do to sort of help ourselves or help other people? And he looked at it as more of like how developmental psychologists would say in life, we go through from when we're kids to growing into adulthood, there's certain tasks we have to accomplish through normal development. And William Morton said, you know, grief's kind of the same. It's a life experience that we're going through. And there's certain tasks that if we can accomplish them, we'll be in a better place to be able to cope with that grief. And so I think that resonates with people so much more because they're active a little bit. There's something I can do rather than just sit back and kind of wait for the next stage to come along.
Yes.
So I think, like you, I think many people who work in this field really, really connect more with the task than with those stages.
Absolutely. Well, I could not wait to ask you that question and let you expound on that for sure, because it's such a commonly, I remember somebody said to me that somebody asked them, what stage are you in? And I was like, no, you know, like if I'm grieving, I'm not thinking about what stage.
Exactly. Or when you get really angry and somebody's like, I think you're in the anger stage. It's like, no, you didn't just say that to me. Like, that's the last thing I need to hear when I'm angry. So I think that people want, again, I think when people are watching us grieve, you know, when people are seeing someone in their life that they love who's grieving, it can be a really helpless feeling, you know, when you want to provide somebody support, you want to take care of them, you want to connect with them and be there. And people often don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. And so then they like rely on these 5 stages because they think it's this one thing I've heard about grief or this one thing I know about grief. And they then start wanting to use it. And unfortunately, it often just alienates the person grieving because they're like, is that really what you think? You think I'm grieving in stages? That's not what's happening here. My grief is much bigger than that and different.
Or that I should be rushing, like maybe I did something wrong because I'm, you know, I'm not in the right stage or something like that. You know, this is a great segue into, you know, supporting people who are grieving or who may be stuck. I do believe people can grow through their grief. And I do that there is grief recovery, right? But you will never stop missing your loved one. But supporting people who are grieving, I read something that says, it is not a person's responsibility to become the grief comforter, but rather a grief supporter, right? Yes. And I love that. Yes. And it takes the responsibility off of people because it's a lot of responsibility to comfort people in their grief.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the reasons people get so scared about what do I say to somebody grieving is because we feel like I need to say something to make them feel better. And letting go of that and just being able to say, no, like it's not about taking away their pain right now.
Absolutely.
It's about saying, how can I just let them know that I am here to support them through that pain, to be with them in their pain, but I'm not trying to take away or remove the experiences, the emotional experience they're having. I'm not trying to rush them through it. I'm not, because we know that it is often the worst thing that's ever happened to someone has just happened. Yes. And so this idea that we're going to have some magic words that are going to make them feel suddenly better, like that's not a pressure we need to put on ourselves.
Absolutely.
Being able to kind of just be there, be present and say, I'm here to support you through whatever it is. I don't necessarily know what the right things to say are. I don't necessarily know what you need, but I want to be here and talk about that and be open and honest in any way that I can be and be there. I think those are the things that people often need to hear from the people around them.
Absolutely. Can you take a minute to talk about the DLR?
Excuse me?
The doer, listener, and recreation type
Oh, yes, yes,
of.
yes. So I think that this is thinking about the people who are in our lives and recognizing that our support systems and we individually, we all have leanings, we all have strengths, we all have areas that we're not so strong, we have ways we like to cope, we have ways we don't like to cope. And a huge part of being someone who provides support and somebody who seeks support and needs support is being mindful of those things and being able to look at that and say, how do I reach out to the people who are going to be the best people for what I need right now?
Yes.
And how do I stop trying to expect one person to be all things to me? And we have a big tendency to do that. I think, you've got your best friend or your sister, your cousin, somebody who has always been, one of the people closest to you. And when you go through something devastating, it's easy to want them to suddenly be able to show up in every way. You want them to be able to be your shoulder to cry on, to listen, to, do all of those things with non-judgment. But you also want them to be the person who's going to help you problem solve things and who's going to be there to practically support you. And then you also want them to be the person who's going to help you get your mind off things and blow off steam and that just might not be their strength, right? They might lean towards one of those areas or another. So being able to think through your support system and say, who's really good at what? Who's really able to support me? And then thinking about who do I need in a given moment, and learning to ask for the things that we need to ask for. Sometimes it's about going to somebody and saying, what I need from you right now is just for you to listen. I don't need you to give me any advice. I don't need you to fix it. I just need to get this out and I need somebody to listen. And I came to you because you're a good listener. But even if they're a good listener, still giving them that little bit of guidance.
Sure, yes.
To say, like, you might be tempted to want to fix me right now, but you don't have to. And in another situation, being able to go to somebody and say, hey, like, I really don't know what to do. I'm so overwhelmed. I need somebody to help me think through my next steps and where am I going to go from here? What am I going to do to deal with this? Some of the logistical stuff that comes up in grief, the practical realities, and ask for that. So I think a lot of it is knowing how to find the right person and ask for what we need.
Yes, I love that. I love that perspective for sure. I love you.
I love you too. So this all works out great that we're talking about all this.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I want to shift into just how you serve specifically.
Yeah.
Because I'm watching our time, and talk a little bit about the resources that you have for clients, for people who are grieving, as well as for professionals, and maybe towards the end, not only how can people connect with you, but what is your call to action of getting professionals to serve with you?
Absolutely. I think one of the things, I didn't say this in kind of how Eleanor and I started What's Your Grief, but I think an important part to understanding the resources we offer is that we were really interested in the fact that when you looked at people's idea of what do you do for grief support, everybody was like, therapist or support group. That's what you do. You go to a counselor or you go to a support group. And we were working with a lot of people who were like, I don't want to go to a counselor. I don't want to go to a support group. I don't have time. I don't, that's not what I want to do. And we were doing a lot of that. And we both had used a lot of things other than therapy and support groups in our own grieving. And we already knew all these great therapists offering, counselors offering great counseling and support groups. And we thought, we could maybe do something to fill this space for people who are looking for something else. And maybe it will be in addition to their support group or therapy. Maybe it'll be instead. Maybe it'll be their first step. But so that's kind of where we started What's Your Grief. And we started with this just like education, going to our website, articles about grief. We were just writing and writing and writing and saying, we just want to provide people good information, but also accessible, like easy to understand information. A lot of the stuff that was out there, we just felt like it wasn't always relatable. So our website has all that. And then from there, that's when we started going, all right, some people are really interested in more. And so we started offering self-paced kind of online courses where you could dive in more deeply. So we would have a lot of articles about something like, maybe about navigating grief. And then for people, you can read those kind of free articles. And then for people who wanted more, we made online courses where they could really go in and in a more systematic way start to learn more. And then some were creative. So we had articles about journaling. We were always doing stuff about using photography and artistic expression to express your grief, saying not everybody wants to use their words. Some people really want to use these other outlets. And then we kind of same thing. We took those spaces and we said, well, now we have an online journaling course for people who really want more of a step-by-step guide and a grief and photography. So we created that space. And what we found was that then professionals, even though we were creating all these courses for people who were grieving, we found all these professionals in the field, social workers and counselors, who were taking the courses. And they were saying, I know these are for grievers, but I'm taking it because I haven't gotten good grief education. And so I'm trying to learn through this. And that's where we said, we really need to start thinking about providing continuing education for grievers. We've spent so much time on our own learning and we're lucky enough that this is what we do full time. So I have time to read the new journal articles that come out and the new research, because that grief is all I have to think about. Whereas so many other social workers and counselors, they're thinking about anxiety and trauma and depression, and they're trying to keep up with everything. And so we really felt like, okay, we can be a place to help translate that complicated research journal information into everyday terms for people grieving on the website. But then also we could do continuing education for professionals. So we offer that continuing education, and those are online. So we used to do them in person before COVID, but COVID pushed us into this online space in a great way. And so we were able to offer those things. And then we have a lot on our social media communities as just a way for people to connect with each other, do more kind of informal things. We do photo challenges on there. We do other things where we try to help people to share with each other, asking questions and answers. Somebody will message and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. And then we'll try to kind of crowdsource some responses and how did you deal with this, and helping people in those ways. So those are kind of the big ways are our website and our social media, but trying to connect in some of those non-traditional outside of just counseling and support groups.
Love it. Your website for people is whatsyourgrief.com.
Yes, correct.
And your social media is?
At What's Your Grief.
At What's Your Grief?
Yep. On all the platforms, we're out at What's Your Grief.
Great. And then you have TikTok as well.
We do. We just started TikTok not too long ago. I don't know. I keep saying I'm too old for TikTok, but we're doing a bit on there anyway, because I think, we just figure it's kind of nice to be in these different spaces doing, as much as we can, even if it's just, okay, maybe this just lets people know we have other things that they can seek out. Maybe then they seek out the course or the website. And we have a book coming out in a couple months. So we think hopefully that'll get some people who aren't necessarily the digital folks, but who are more like to have some paper in their hands.
I'm excited about your book for sure. I've already pre-ordered mine.
Oh,
I love the fact that you have those continuing education courses. So is there a call to action for other professionals?
Yeah, I think for us, our biggest call to action for professionals is to get people to go beyond the 5 stages. And I know that sounds so small and basic, but I think every week I have somebody who tells me, my doctor told me that I'm going to go through the 5 stages. My child's teacher told me that they're going to go through the 5 stages. I think everybody has absorbed these so much that it is the one and only thing they know about grief, and then they kind of fall back on it. So we would always push people to say, learn just learn something beyond the 5 stages, whether it's continuing bonds theory, whether it's William Worden's tasks of mourning, whether it's there's the dual process model of grief. But learn some and know that the 5 stages are one of so many theories, and one that came out 60 years ago. Like, we need to stay current. And then I think once people do even a little bit of research, then it opens this whole world where they suddenly realize, wow, there's so much happening in this grief space. And now when I talk to clients, when I talk to friends, when I talk to somebody at church, I can, instead of falling back on those 5 stages, I can understand that grief is a lot more complex than that I can reinforce that idea that I know that I'm going to need to keep checking in on them as time passes, that they're not going to hit acceptance after a year and move on, So I think that would be our big call to action, just any one thing that can push you a little bit past those 5 stages.
I accept the challenge, definitely. And
I know you're already like
I've
with that.
already
You're like, I've
accepted the
already
challenge.
but
I've already accepted the
I
challenge.
think it's hopefully helping other people to do it. I just read some new research that was about how many people still out there believe that the 5 stages are the gold standard of grieving. And it's just, the numbers are huge. And so I think just helping people to know how much more there is, it goes a really long way. So I appreciate you bringing attention to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm so thankful for you to be here. Well, Litsa, oh my gosh, I could just talk to you for another hour or two or more, or the rest of the day. Know you are busy with with how you serve and who you serve and what you're serving about. And so I just want to thank you for making time for Empower to Empower You podcast. And I just love the fact that we are professionally and now personally connected.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
yes, I'm gonna put your information in the show notes, and just really thank you for taking time to join. So I really want to encourage every person who's listening, please share this podcast episode with somebody. Connect with what'syourgrief.com, connect with her on social media, stay connected, take one of the courses, take several of the courses. They are amazing and they're very relatable, practical, educational, and she does it in such a way that you're not going to be blown away by terminology and all the things. It's very easy to understand for sure. So thank you so much again, Litsa, for joining, and I'm going to stay in touch with you for sure.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes. All right, y'all. I'll be back next time with another amazing episode. Have a great week on purpose.